Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Chatham House. My name is James Nixie. I'm the head of the Russia and Eurasia Programme here. I've just got to get through some administrivia, which I'll do very, very quickly because we only have an hour, as always. The event's on the record tonight, ladies and gentlemen. It's being live streamed. You can comment on Twitter at #CHEvents, and you can ask questions at #AskCH, and you can email questions to questions@chathamhouse.org. Please, ladies and gentlemen, would you put your phones on silent? They interfere with the vast array of technical wizardry we've got going on here. And I'll just very briefly introduce the speakers, in batting order, actually. To my immediate left, Neil Buckley is Eastern Europe editor for the FT and was a former Moscow bureau chief. And Neil will look especially tonight at the situation in Crimea in the next few days and weeks. Then secondly, hopefully, I don't know if former Ambassador John Herbst can hear me.
I can.
Or not. John, are you there?
I am here. I hear you fine.
Yes, I can just about hear you. I don't know if anybody else in this audience can. But I suppose if you... Can you still hear me, sir?
I can hear you very well.
You can hear me very well. I don't think we can hear you, can we? Sort of. Okay. We'll try and turn it up. But you are there in your living room, and thank you for being here. Ambassador Herbst is the former American ambassador to Ukraine, and is also the director of the Center for Complex Operations. This is certainly a complex operation right here, right now, at the National Defense University. And finally, on my far left, Sir Roderic Lyne is well known to all of you, I think. He is a former British ambassador to Moscow, and he is deputy chairman on the Chatham House Council. Many of you here would have been here 2 weeks ago when I think I said to you that we had the best possible panel to cover these events. That clearly was an absolute lie. We today have the best possible panel to cover these events. Ambassador Herbst, who's certainly disappeared from my screen, I'm not sure about yours, will look at the reaction from Kiev in particular. And finally, Sir Roderic will look at how the Russians might respond. And I know the title to today's seminar was the international response. I suppose Russia's response is an international response. But we perhaps can deal with that in questions and discussion. That's more than enough from me. Hopefully, Mr. Herbst, you can still hear me, and we will come to you second, and hope that technology sustains itself throughout the next hour. More than enough. Neil, I invite you to have first go.
James, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to take part in this event. I will mostly look forward today, and assume that most of you are aware of what's been happening in Crimea in the last couple of weeks and of the importance of Crimea. But just a quick word of introduction. Crimea, of course, a 2 million strong peninsula, the southern part of Ukraine, the northern part of the Black Sea, strategically very important, has been inhabited by a number of different peoples over the centuries, passed under Russian influence in 1783 under Catherine the Great, but was transferred to Ukraine only in 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev in what was essentially an administrative change. So only 60 years ago did it pass from Russia to Ukraine. Now, the referendum which will take place on Sunday has two questions. The first question is, are you in favor of Crimea's reunification, which is vosojedinение for Russian speakers, with Russia as a subject of the Russian Federation? The second question is, are you in favor of the restoration of Crimea's 1992 constitution and of the status of Crimea as part of Ukraine? Now, the second question is somewhat ambiguous because there were two constitutions in 1992. There was one that declared Crimea independent of Ukraine, and then there was another one later in the year which returned it to Ukraine, but under the special autonomy status which it has enjoyed ever since, which guaranteed it particular rights for the Russian language and so on. So it appears the second question may have been left deliberately confusing, perhaps to encourage as many people as possible to vote for the first option. It appears that an overwhelmingly positive vote is the most likely scenario. The Russian population in Crimea is only 60% of the total. The latest polling data before the disturbances in Ukraine began in the last 3 or 4 months showed that only 42% of people supported rejoining Russia, although it was a significant minority even then. But what we have to remember is this referendum will take place essentially under military occupation, so if you like, at the point of a gun, and in a kind of information blockade. Ukrainian television channels have been shut off the air, taken off the air in Crimea, and the information that is coming to Crimeans is coming entirely from Russian television now and from Crimean channels, which are portraying the new government in Kiev very aggressively as a bunch of fascists and neo-Nazis who pose a terrible threat to Crimea. There's also been a very heavy information campaign with posters around Crimea saying things like "Stop fascismu," "Stop fascism," and "Домой в Россию," let's go home to Russia. So it seems fairly clear what the outcome is likely to be. Of course, Crimean authorities, like many in the ex-Soviet Union, are used to delivering the desired result through so-called administrative resources. It's very unclear whether there will be any international observers admitted to observe the poll as well. The question then, I guess, is what will Russia do if there is a positive vote in Crimea to rejoin? So far, both heads of Russia's House of Parliament have indicated that they would endorse this decision and swiftly move to reabsorb Crimea into Russia. Russia has also passed or is preparing legislation that will make it easier for new regions to be absorbed into Russia. And this could all happen, theoretically, as quickly as Friday of next week, the 21st of March. Russia appears to have been preparing for this within Crimea itself, with a media campaign on television advising people on how they can change their passports when the time comes, and explaining that Russia will be passing out Russian passports to the people of Crimea. I think, however, the one area of wiggle room, perhaps the one area which may still be open to some kind of negotiation, is whether Russia really does act on the result of this referendum immediately. I think the referendum is going to take place. There's nothing that's going to stop that now. There's no way that could not happen. But the one question is whether Russia immediately accepts it and moves to absorb and effectively annex Crimea, or whether it simply recognizes the result but says we will move in time to reabsorb Crimea, which would then leave the status a little bit more like that of South Ossetia or Abkhazia in Georgia, which have declared independence and been recognized by Russia and a handful of other countries only, but remain as a kind of irritant and pressure point which Russia can use in Georgia. There are one or two issues, I have to finish in a couple of moments, but there are one or two very important issues here, I think, surrounding this referendum, which make it very concerning. One is that there is no real pretext for Russia's actions in Crimea. At least in South Ossetia in 2008, when the Georgian War began, a pretext was, if you like, created. There were tensions in South Ossetia and Abkhazia for some time before the summer. Arguably, Russia was responsible for stoking up those tensions, and Georgia's president, Mikhail Saakashvili, launched an attack on the South Ossetian capital, Tskhinvali, in which South Ossetians died and some Russian peacekeepers died. So there was a kind of pretext then for the Russian military to come in. The Russian military came in. It was acknowledged, of course, that it was the Russian military. In this case, there is no pretext. The case that Russia is putting it broadly is that Crimea is under threat from fascists and Nazis who've taken over Kiev, which is false. There is no direct threat. The narrow pretext which was used was that there was supposedly an attack on the Interior Ministry of Crimea in Simferopol by fascists from Kiev. Our reporters from other newspapers went to the Interior Ministry building, found there was absolutely no evidence of attack at all. In fact, people at the building told them there'd been no attack. Even even pro-Russian demonstrators and members of the Russian self-defense units that have sprung up in Crimea who were around the building at that time said there'd been no attack on this building. So, as John Kerry said the day after it happened, this was an entirely bogus pretext, which I think makes the situation very worrying. Russia, of course, has not acknowledged that it's actually its soldiers who are patrolling and surrounding military sites in Crimea, even though military experts here and NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, have come out and said that it's very easy to identify that these men in Crimea as Russian Spetsnaz, special troops, and even identify the units which they've come from. The second issue is that this referendum is clearly illegal in all sorts of ways. It's against the Ukrainian constitution, which says that parts of Ukraine can only secede through a referendum of all Ukrainians. It's against many articles of international law. There's not supposed to be any shifting of borders in the presence of military occupation. It sets a very dangerous precedent, potentially, that could be used by Russia elsewhere in other former Soviet territories, and a precedent that could, in fact, be used by other countries, particularly China in some of its territorial disputes. And it's a very big blow to nuclear non-proliferation efforts, because Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, then the third largest in the world, in 1994, signed the Budapest memorandum with Russia, US, and the UK, in which those countries pledged to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. That respect has clearly been entirely broken now, and the conclusion for other countries will be don't give up nuclear weapons, and if you can get hold of them, because that's the only security guarantee that you can have.
Thank you, Neil. Right, ladies and gentlemen, here's the big test to see if this still works. Ambassador Herbst, can you still hear me?
I hear you very well.
Okay, and can you hear Ambassador Herbst, ladies and gentlemen? Yes. Okay, so we've had a great context setting from Neil here, and I wonder if you could, if you were listening earlier, if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about how it looks in Kiev, both in the run-up to the referendum there and with regards to their own government, and in the run-up to the May 25th elections and beyond, because there have already been some worrying developments in how the Kiev government is being formed. Anyway, I don't want to be prescriptive. Over to you for 7 to 8 minutes, please, sir.
Let's talk first about how the current Ukrainian government is reacting to the crisis in Crimea and perhaps in the east of Ukraine. I think the key word to describe their approach is caution. Obviously, they are very unhappy with the Russian invasion in Crimea, and they have been outspoken in defending their territorial integrity. At the same time, they've been very careful not to take any step which could be interpreted by the Russians as provocation to military action. Put another way, they are avoiding Saakashvili's mistake. And the Kremlin has tried to bait Ukrainian forces into firing the first shot. Regarding the question of who these troops are, first they appeared as local militia, and they were provocative in their approach towards Ukrainian soldiers in Crimea. However, when that did not produce a Ukrainian response, they then announced for a brief period of time they were in fact Russian soldiers. And again, no Ukrainian response in terms of firing in the streets. So now they're back to being unnamed soldiers, according to the Kremlin. The government in Ukraine, in Kiev, understands that to withstand this Russian pressure, they have to be able to unite the country. And one of the shrewdest things they've done is to reach out to oligarchs and elites in the East to bring them into their government. So Mr. Taruta, the industrialist from the Donbass, is now the acting governor of Donetsk. Mr. Kolomoisky, major oligarch in Dnipropetrovsk, is now the governor there. Even more interesting is the fact that before Kolomoisky was offered that post, Viktor Pinchuk was offered the job. Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Pinchuk were mortal enemies. I suspect Tymoshenko has something to do with these offers to the oligarchs in the East. And if she was behind the offer to Pinchuk, it just shows that the most formidable tactical politician in Ukraine is doing everything in her power to make Ukraine stronger to deal with the Russian danger. The government in Kyiv has also been active in preventing Russian shenanigans in the East. The often discussed divide between East and West in Ukraine is much less today than it was 20 years ago at independence and 10 years ago when I was in Kyiv. And because of that, because natural Ukrainian citizens who are pro-Russian are not going out in the streets in any numbers in Donetsk, in Kharkiv, in Dnipropetrovsk, the Russians are having to bus in their own citizens to pretend to be Ukrainians demanding action against the quote-unquote fascists in Kyiv. And the government in Kyiv has been careful to avoid any provocation vis-a-vis these protesters, although they have their own organizers on the streets who have been putting together demonstrations in Kharkiv, in Donetsk, in favor of the government in Kyiv. Okay, so that's their reaction to the current crisis. Oh, one more point. It's important, and it's unknown. It's pretty clear to me, as an analyst, that the government is not going to fight Crimea with arms. They are, however, sending signals that they may fight in the East. There's also, it looks like, some conscription of young men going on as a precaution, the formulation of national guards as a precaution against the Russian invasion in the East. I'm not certain how they will react if any Russian troops actually cross the border. But the possibility of bloodshed goes up seriously if that happens, as opposed to what's happening in Crimea. Excuse me, there's one more point on the current standoff. The Russians in Crimea have a logistical problem if the Ukrainian government chooses to play the type of hardball vis-a-vis supplying Crimea that Putin has been playing with gas supplies to Ukraine since the winter of 2005 and 2006. All electricity and water coming into the peninsula comes from the rest of Ukraine. So Ukrainian authorities could shut that off. I don't know if they will, but this is something to watch. Okay, looking beyond the current standoff in Crimea, it's pretty clear that that elections will go ahead in Ukraine for a new president in May. It's also likely that despite this serious national crisis, that the elections coming up will feature jockeying among the different parties for position. How that plays out, I can predict right now, but that I think it's premature just to speculate. But certainly, Yulia Tymoshenko remains a very ambitious lady, even if she does not look to be in very good health after her years in captivity. Equally true, Mr. Klitschko remains very popular around the country. Heavyweight champions tend to be popular wherever they go. And so he has a natural attraction in the East, which most other politicians in the government, the current government, do not have. Petro Poroshenko has emerged from these months of crisis with a new stature that he had not enjoyed before. And it's likely that these folks will be angling for advantage, even as the country faces this nasty threat from the Kremlin. Last point. I think it was a brilliant stroke for the government in Kyiv to invite Taruta Kolomoisky into the government. However, and this is an important however, doing that once again empowers the oligarchs who represent a specific, you might say, socioeconomic problem for the country. And it was absolutely clear that the people on the Maidan who forced Yanukovych out were unhappy with the oligarchs, including the oligarchs and the opposition parties in Kyiv. And so their ability to check the influence of the old oligarchs, their ability to serve as a counterweight to the nastiness of normal business as usual policy in Ukraine has gone down as a result of this measure of bringing the oligarchs to withstand the Kremlin's. That's basically what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was crystal clear as well as very informed, albeit perhaps slightly more optimistic about the makeup of the probable makeup, current makeup and probable makeup of the Kiev government than I was expecting, but perhaps we can come back to that.
Okay.
Roderic, Russia, in particular, not so much motives, but strategy and intentions going forward.
The Russian political commentator Georgy Boft yesterday described the situation from a Russian perspective as a steamroller going downhill. It's impossible to stop, and nobody knows exactly how much damage it will cause in the end. I think we need to remember that the Russian president plays judo, not chess. That means he understands leverage. It means that when he takes a fall, when he's put on the mat, his instinct is to leap up straight away and try to get the other guy on the mat. He's not somebody who tends to think several steps down the road. And I think Russia now finds itself in a pretty awkward position. The economy is in trouble. It's weakening. It's a real point of vulnerability. It depends on exports to the European Union, the largest by far export market for Russia. It's very short of investment. It's suffering capital flight. So it's not in a good place. I think the Western reaction thus far has been probably rather stronger than the Kremlin expected, including a more united European reaction. I think they will have been surprised by the strength of the reaction, in particular from Germany, seeing Foreign Minister Steinmeier going around the Baltic states to try to offer reassurance about their sovereignty. The very strong words today by Chancellor Angela Merkel. There has been no support thus far for Russia's actions from anywhere around the world. China has very obviously put itself at a distance from Russia on this. So right now, Russia has won Crimea and it's lost Ukraine. So where does it go from here? I think we need to just go back and say, what were the Russian objectives? The broad strategic objective for many years, as we know, has been to be the dominant force in the post-Soviet space, to prevent Western incursion into that space, or as it's commonly described in Moscow, Western encirclement, very much to integrate Ukraine, by far the most important part of that space for Russia, and Belarus, to the extent possible, in structures controlled by Russia. That doesn't mean taking over their sovereignty. It does mean having a dominant or a controlling position there, certainly trying to leverage them into the Eurasian Union, but also dominating sectors of the economy, the gas supply, banking, telecoms, parts of heavy industry. In the current crisis, the first objective, this is where it all started, was to get Ukraine to sign up to the customs union with Russia and Belarus, Kazakhstan to come in, and prevent an agreement with the European Union. Initially, Moscow won that, and then it lost with the ouster of Yanukovych. It's still an objective, but I think Moscow has made it much harder to achieve. Second objective after the ouster of Yanukovych was to undermine the interim government, to try to secure a rebalancing of the forces in Kiev, in Ukraine, in a more favorable direction to Russia. That's still in play. It's also much harder to achieve now, particularly because of the defection of so many of the deputies from the parties of the region and of oligarchs and of other leading figures in Ukraine, many of them Russian-speaking, native Russian speakers, people who were always in favor of friendly relations with Russia, but who were very attached to Ukrainian sovereignty. It was rather striking that very early in this crisis, former presidents Kuchma and Kravchuk, who were certainly not hostile to Russia, signed up with Yushchenko on a statement that basically said, hands off our sovereignty. Third objective is the non-return of Crimea to Ukraine. I think that's much more a point of tactical leverage than a great strategic gain. After all, strategically, because of the basing agreement, Russia already had Crimea. There is no threat to Russia's strategic position through Crimea. And then we must never forget the personal objectives of President Putin and the ruling group and the very small circle of people within which real decisions are made in Moscow, where the critical factor is to retain power, retain control. And clearly, taking Crimea has been enormously popular, not with the intelligentsia, not with the political class or the business class, where clearly there's a lot of unhappiness about this action, but with the mass of the Russian populace. Good for Mr. Putin's ratings. So where are we now? I think there are three possible scenarios. I think we'll have a better idea, firstly after Secretary Kerry's discussions tomorrow with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and then when we see how Moscow reacts in the way that Neil was discussing to the referendum on Sunday, as to whether a negotiated diplomatic outcome is possible. But I see three theoretical possibilities, one of which would be a negotiated outcome. Russia has not yet passed the point of no return. Putin has not yet officially and formally used the powers that he gave himself through the Federation Council to deploy Russian troops in an acknowledged way onto Ukrainian territory. They are still taking the position that these guys with no badges on their uniform are some kind of unofficial local forces. They're not ours, Gov. In a way, that's helpful. A negotiated outcome would certainly require Russia to reaffirm respect for Ukrainian sovereignty, to remove the use or the threat of force. I think a part of it would be agreement on a process to negotiate the future status of Crimea, which clearly is something about which there could have been a negotiation. It's made much harder when there's unilateral action, but there is stuff to negotiate there. I think there would need to be recognition that Russia has legitimate interests in Ukraine, which indeed it clearly has. And in Ukraine's best interests, a good relationship with Russia is, I think, essential. The Russians would want something to, as it were, legitimize the government in Kiev. I think that would be a difficult point of negotiation. At the moment, they are talking to it in a small way, but they are taking the view that this is not a legitimately constituted authority, it's the result of a coup. I very much doubt if there is much to negotiate about Ukraine's relationship with the European Union. And clearly, if you did have a negotiated outcome, there would be a halting of the sanctions process. That, for Putin, would allow him to claim victory over Crimea and to avoid worse damage in other areas, but it would leave him in a weaker position in Ukraine. So it wouldn't be a great outcome. The middle scenario, I think probably the most likely one, is one in which actually there turn out not to be grounds for negotiation, in which certainly that window would be closed if Russia recognized or indeed annexed Crimea, or Russia has a number of options when you get the result of the referendum, whether it's straightforward annexation or recognition of some form of autonomy. The risk is that at this point they would close the door and you would be in a situation of continuing tension along the border, a frozen conflict, a northern Cyprus and Abkhazia. And again, this is something where Mr. Putin would claim victory to his domestic audience, but at considerable cost, quite a lot of political isolation, the end of the Eurasian Union, I would have thought, in a meaningful sense, his aspirations for it. Long-run damage to the economy, which would bite over time, and quite possibly splits in the elite of a serious kind, and he would have lost Kiev. The most serious scenario, I hope the least probable, but absolutely cannot be excluded, would be a further escalation, a push across the border into eastern Ukraine, deployment of Russian troops, and a serious risk of conflict between Russian and Ukrainian forces. The Russians would not be welcomed as liberators in eastern Ukraine. That would clearly trigger a very strong, a lasting reaction from the West. I think it would be high risk for Putin, not least internally, because I think at that point, this is guesswork. I think if Russian and Ukrainian troops start shooting at each other, then the people who at the moment are applauding his actions in Russia would start to get pretty uncomfortable, and I think support might drain away, and certainly the consequences in terms of Russia's alienation from the rest of the world would be very severe. But in the current situation, with armed men running around and some pretty wild and hot-headed people and hardliners on both sides, an incident can trigger this. You certainly cannot exclude this scenario. It would leave a fortress Russia. A fortress Russia wasn't a great option even in Brezhnev's day. It's a much worse one for a weaker Russia in a globalized world.
Thank you, Roderic, and especially for those three scenarios, which I think I'd be very interested if anybody has any further scenarios. But I'd also like to, maybe by way of the first question, I'm certainly take two more, because I'll do rounds of three, ask you, I mean, since you mentioned points of no return, I mean, I would ask perhaps what would make the West react with even stronger measures than it already has? What are the red lines for the West as far as Russia's actions are concerned? So if you could take that as question number one, Roderic, then I will immediately open this up to question number two, effectively. So floor's open. First person I see is Thomas Raines at the back. Please, ladies and gentlemen, give your name and affiliation, not Chatham House member, because most of you already are, but a proper job, either current or previous. That would be useful. I know you've got a proper job,
James,
Tom,
I have a proper job as your colleague.
do.
I'm Tom Raines, I work on the Europe programme at Chatham House. I wanted to ask what the panel's view were on the offer from the EU to sign the political elements of an association agreement probably next week with the interim government in Ukraine. It seems to me that there is a risk that if they do that when the present government doesn't have a formal mandate, given how divisive it was and the key role it played in creating the disruption in Ukraine in the first place, that might be a hasty move before any government in Ukraine has a full mandate.
Thanks. Next question, sticking with Chatham House for a second, I'll go with Sanford Henry on the far left, please.
Thank you. Sanford Henry, Chatham House. The question is related to Turkey because of the minority in the area in terms of the Tatars. What do you think the Turkish position would be in terms of reacting to this, and also the value of the Bosphorus in terms of trade?
Okay, thank you. So we've got red lines, association agreements, and Turkey. Ambassador, can you still hear us?
Yes, I hear you just fine.
That's great. Well, maybe you'd like to start then. Would you like to? I think perhaps particularly look at the association agreement question from Thomas there. Could you perhaps address that first of all?
Sure. First, let me offer what I consider a minority view regarding what precipitated the crisis. I don't think Yanukovych backed away from the trade deal with the EU because of the Russian threat. I think he backed away because the EU insisted on Tymoshenko's release, and he was not going to go for that. Okay. I think he hid behind the Russians. Having said that, in specific response to his question, I believe it would not be politically problematic for the government in Kyiv to sign that deal now, because I don't think there's tremendous opposition anywhere in the country to that agreement. Having said that, I think it would be prudent for them to hold off until after the election. Why take any risks whatsoever?
Thank you. Neil, can I lump you with a Turkey question by any chance?
No. Can I ask,
I know you want to.
Can I answer the previous question?
Yes.
On the association agreement, I actually think this is potentially very problematic. I think that I think it's important that the EU sends positive signals to Ukraine and gives whatever support it can. But what we have been hearing is that Russia has particular concerns about the association agreement, which may not have been widely appreciated previously. Not so much about the trade elements of the association agreement and the DCFTA, but about some security elements, security guarantees that are in the political chapters of the association agreement. I've been told that Sergei Glaziev, who is Mr. Putin's advisor on Ukraine and the kind of the front man on Ukraine, has in a number of conversations made clear that it's these security guarantees, in fact, that are a particular concern for Russia, because although they may look rather innocuous if you read them, Russia sees in them a kind of backdoor attempt to put closer integration with Western security structures, and particularly NATO, back on the table, or even accelerating it. Now, those concerns may be misguided, but they are concerns of Russia. And I also heard from an EU ambassador that it was an issue that Mr. Lavrov had raised quite forcibly recently. So I think actually it would be, and if there are any EU diplomats listening, I think it would be potentially a very big mistake actually to sign this agreement next week, because I think it could send precisely the wrong message to Russia at a very sensitive time. And our understanding is that the whole idea to sign these political chapters only came up during the European Union summit last Thursday, when they were groping for some kind of positive signal to send. And someone said, okay, let's sign, in fact it was Mr. Barroso, said, okay, let's sign the political elements of the association agreement. Quite possibly none of the EU leaders in the room had read those chapters and knew what they said. So I think we should be looking for other ways to support Ukraine right now, and not, in my view, doing that. And I think that there is a perfect reason to delay this, to say that we should only sign these agreements once there is a democratically elected president of Ukraine in place, which there will be after May the 25th.
Okay, two controversial answers there, both from John and from Neil. Interesting. Rod, can I get you off the association agreement, if you don't mind terribly, and back onto Russia and the red lines question, and possibly Turkey if you feel like it?
I think I'll leave Turkey to Ambassador Herbst, who knows much more about it than I do. I think red lines after Syria are maybe a term best avoided. The EU's announcement had 3 stages in it. The first stage has already effectively happened. If Russia formally and unilaterally annexed Crimea following the referendum on Sunday, then clearly we are in the next stage. I think the space for negotiation at that point is gone, and that will trigger second stage sanctions by the West. Russia could leave some wiggle room by doing something short of that, by saying, we note your very strong opinions and desire to join us, O Ukraine, but of course there are procedures that need to be gone through, and then they could, as it were, spin that process out. I mean, ideally they'd say, all right, that's your wish, but this thing can only happen under international law through agreement with the sovereign government of Ukraine. They might say, when there is such a government at the moment, we don't recognize it. So they do have, as I said, a number of options. But if they go for annexation, in effect, integration, then I think that does cross a point. Clearly, the most serious escalation would be if Putin used the powers he has given himself, and you've got these people exercising on the borders right now to deploy forces into eastern Ukraine. I don't just mean Crimea, I mean towards the Donbass and so on, at which point we'll be into a deep freeze.
But Rod, what would trigger a response well beyond financial sanctions and expulsions from clubs? What will make the West do something qualitatively different? The West response has, as you say, been tougher than most of us in this room, I think, expected. What would Russia have to do to make it even tougher? I don't want to talk about the military response, but what would be a...
I don't talk about military response either, but clearly the limits of NATO membership are well defined and clearly will be defended, and Russia knows that. But I mean, I think I've just identified the 2 steps that are likely to take us into deeper territory. If Russia went for the most serious of these, I think there would be a huge and lasting Western reaction. I think it would have a material effect on defense budgets in Europe. I think that it would have a very large effect on the amount of trade and other interaction with Russia. I don't want to go into all of it because I hope it's not going to happen, but also I think that we can get into rather gruesome territory. But it would be very, very strong, and I think it would unite a lot of people behind these measures.
Okay, 15 minutes left, ladies and gentlemen. I'm envisaging 2 rounds of 3 questions each. Anthony Robinson, who's actually in the centre of the centre, roughly there. Just wait for the mic, would you, Anthony, not least so that John can hear in America.
Anthony Robinson, I used to be what Neil is now, but the FT. Whilst 20,000 anonymous soldiers are milling around in the Ukraine, in the Crimea, a state-of-the-art helicopter assault ship is going through sea trials in the Atlantic. It is one of two assault ships which were sold to Russia by President Sarkozy as a reward, or presumably is perceived as a reward for the Russian invasion of Abkhazia and Ossetia. One of the reasons, I suspect, why we're in the position we are now. My question is, at what point do we tell the Russians that this contract is no longer viable? And at what point does NATO start to use these two vehicles, because France obviously is going to need to have them bought by somebody, perhaps, hopefully by NATO, and what would that do to improve our position, the strategic position of the West in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea?
The Russians are training on them now, aren't they? Anyway, gentlemen, middle of the front, in fact. Right here, yeah, please.
I'm Frank Kelly, Globus Foundation. If Putin plays judo, which game of sport does Obama plays?
Oh.
Isn't the matter that what encourages Putin to play tough is a perceived weakness of the American president? And is Obama weak? So I would like to know the panel's opinion.
Thank you. And yes, gentlemen, middle again, 3 rows back, glasses, dark suit. Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vasyl Miroshnichenko. I'm a director of the Ukrainian British City Club. And my question is about energy. What do you think will happen with, there are significant resources of gas and oil in the Black Sea, just off the coast from Crimea. EDF and Eni and ExxonMobil, ExxonMobil is negotiating. Eni and EDF have already invested into the exploration of the resources there. What do you think will happen? And don't you think that international companies now investing into the energy resources of Russia can no longer do that? And by actually doing that, they are supporting Russia's aggression in Ukraine and actually violating international law. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so we've got energy, we've got French ships and destinations, and we have got Ambassador Herbst. Perhaps you could look at answer the Obama question. Do we have a foreign policy American president again, effectively?
I think this is an urban legend which has been peddled by people who don't understand foreign policy. Dick Cheney tried to sell this to the American public last weekend. And he was asked, well, wasn't Mr. Bush in power when the Russians did the same thing in Georgia? And no one ever accused Mr. Bush of being slow on pulling a military trigger. And Mr. Cheney answered, well, that happened at the end of the Bush and the beginning of the Obama administration. A weasel answer. I think President Obama's foreign policy has not been wonderful. And if I were to grade it, I would give it a C+, maybe, a little bit better than that. But that stands very tall compared to President Bush's, the younger Bush's F. Policy. Although it's not nearly as good as Bush 1's B+ or A-. Putin went into Crimea because of his interest in Ukraine, his misguided interest, not because of any perceived weakness in Washington. And I think President Obama's done a pretty good job since this crisis has begun.
Thank you. Can I also invite you to answer Sanford Henry's Turkey question in terms of its... I have tried. Look, I'm trying, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of how do you rate its importance and its possible effect on the current crisis? It's clearly a key player.
The government of Turkey and the people of Turkey are very upset by what has happened in Crimea. There's always been a great relationship historically between the Crimean Tatars and the Turks. As we all know, the Crimean Tatars were forcibly pushed off the peninsula by Stalin during World War II, and a small portion of them have come back. They now represent, at a minimum, 12% of the population. That was 12% according to the census of 2001. And their birth rate is much higher than that of the Slavs in the peninsula. And there's also been some in-migration since that census. Putin has been clever in courting Turkey. And this has been part of his effort to outflank the United States in Europe. And I think that tactic of courting Turkey has taken a severe blow. And that blow will not recover from that blow in the near term. And so I think there'll be a new coldness in relations between Ankara and Moscow but the Turks are not going to do anything provocative. They're pragmatic.
Thank you. Rod and Neil, I'm not going to be prescriptive. Take your pick of energy and French assault ships.
Can I go first?
Yeah.
On the US foreign policy question, I think that Russia is reacting not to perceived weakness on the part of the Obama administration. I think you have to understand the Russian perception of what's been happening in recent years, and I'm not sure that they actually differentiate that much between the different US administrations. The Russian view that we hear over and over again from very senior people in Russia and people connected with them is that they believe the US has had a habit over the past decade of interfering beyond its borders where it didn't have the right to interfere, repeatedly. And we heard President Putin criticize that in his speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 very strongly. And I really think what has provoked Russia's very strong reaction this time is that it honestly believes that the West has tried to lever Ukraine away from Russia. First of all, coming up with this EU treaty as a way of doing it. Then when Mr. Yanukovych didn't sign the EU treaty, the West fomented the demonstrations in Kiev and then was in a certain way complicit in the overthrow of Mr. Yanukovych. I think the top people in Russia do believe this. However absurd it may seem to us, I think that's what they think. It may be that the KGB, or rather the FSB, which Mr. Putin used to work for, of course, is feeding him slanted information, but I think there's a kind of paranoia has set in the Kremlin. And so they don't see the US as weak. They see it as interfering and having interfered once too often in their backyard. And I think there's now a decision on behalf of Moscow to, if you like, teach the West and teach the US a lesson by responding in a very robust way. And my concern is that Russia may go further if it doesn't feel that it's being listened to and that this message has got through.
Take your pick.
Tony Robinson asked at what point we should tell the Russians that the Mistral contract is no longer viable. Now, Tony, while I have reason sometimes to feel envious of President Hollande, I'm not President Hollande. That's a question you should direct to him. But your question does illustrate both the much higher degree, as does the question about energy, the much higher degree of interdependence now between the West and Russia since the end of the Cold War. That means that Russia has much more to lose. It also means that we have more to lose. None of the things that could happen are going to be cost-free. I would be appalled in any case if Russian troops were deployed into eastern Ukraine, and I would be utterly horrified if, in those circumstances, the French continued with that contract. That will, of course, be a decision from them, but I imagine there would be some heavy persuasion from their allies, were they inclined to do anything other than that, which I'm sure they wouldn't do. On question of gas, obviously it would be extremely painful, particularly for Germany, to have to do without Russian gas. It would be painful for all of us if this crisis caused a major spike in energy prices. But there comes a point at which you say, we will have to put up with that, and we can. I think that Russia is much less able to do without its export of gas to Germany. After all, it has nowhere else to send those molecules than Germany could do without Russian gas because it has alternative sources of supply. Remember that the Japanese were able to redivert 30% of their energy needs after the Fukushima nuclear disaster into other sources of energy. If push comes to shove, the same can be done on our side, but we don't want to have to do it.
Great, thank you. Right, 3 final questions. I apologize if it's not you, but I'm afraid I've already chosen. So, gentleman, middle, glasses, dark suit, yes, right there.
Hi, yeah, Marco Gazik, Chatham House, formerly Sussex University. My question really is are we not the pot calling the kettle black in our application of analysis to this situation, given that in other areas of the world, as Mr. Buckley has suggested, the West has acted incredibly unilaterally and without benefit of international law and without respect for territorial integrity of the countries it's attacked in the last few years, beginning with Yugoslavia, moving through Iraq, through to Libya, and so on and so forth, and its plans generally. Can we criticize the Russians for taking the obvious message, which is we have to do the same? We have to be strong, and if they're going to buck international law, who are they to tell us not to?
Okay, familiar question. Thank you. Thomas Imond-Laritz, front, second row back, please. Right here. So, at the front, actually. Come forward. Sorry, right here.
Thank you. Thomas Imond-Laritz, APCO Worldwide. Obviously, Russia and Europe have very different vision of the role of Ukraine and their rights vis-à-vis Ukraine. But at the end of the day, is the major problem and the major cause of the conflict is not the monopoly in the media in Russia, because there are a certain number of facts that happen, but systematic lies in Russian media, and people start believing these lies. And as long as there's no competition and capacity to present facts to the people and to the leadership, there's no way Russia can have a different perspective on Ukraine.
I've understood your point, but is it a question?
So my question, James, good point, is that is there something that the West could do in terms of fostering media plurality and diversity in Russia to avoid the next conflict?
Final question, my colleague and friend, James Sher, please. Friend and colleague, actually, out of order.
James Sher, Russia and Eurasia Programme, Chatham House. If I heard Neil Buckley correctly, he said that signing the association agreement now would be sending an unhelpful signal to Russia. The fundamental rules of the post-Cold War system have been very visibly and brutally transgressed. And my question in those circumstances is, what message do we want to send Russia? What message do we also want to send others, not only Latvia and Poland, but others who are watching this, Japan, China, Iran, Israel?
Thank you, James. I'm sorry, I've got to close it down there. We will go back to the original batting order, which is effectively Western hypocrisy, what can we do about Russian media manipulation, and what messages should we be sending Russia. So batting order was Neil, please.
You want to talk on all three?
Take your pick.
Okay. Well, I mean, I will briefly try and address all three. I think that you have a strong point. That, as I said in my previous answer, that because the West has played fast and loose to some extent with international rules in the last decade, that has somewhat weakened our position. And I think it's something we have to look at very carefully, the role that we have played in creating this kind of environment. In terms of the media monopoly, I think it is an extremely worrying thing, because we have seen a mobilization of the Russian media to the extent that we've never seen before, really, since the Soviet era, and in some ways not even in the Soviet era, to put across a highly slanted, often entirely false picture of what's going on in Ukraine. And it's very damaging, very dangerous. And I think it's something that people have been warning about for a long time, is the extent to which the Russian state dominates the media. I think it's something that unfortunately was very difficult for us to do anything about from the outside. The one big difference today compared with the Soviet era is the internet and the fact that there are a sizable proportion of Russians now who are getting news from the internet and not from television. Unfortunately, we are seeing some signs at the moment that Russia may be starting to clamp down on the internet as well, which I think is a particularly worrying development. And then the third one was yes, James. I take your point. I think we are in a very tense situation. I think it's still possible that Russia could consider going into eastern Ukraine, which I think would be a disastrous step. I think it's the overwhelming priority right now is to calm tensions and not do anything that might provoke Russia into taking the next step. Therefore, I don't think that this is a very propitious moment to be signing an agreement, if indeed this is the very agreement that Russia is most concerned about. I think that the overwhelming priority is calm tensions, keep Russia out of eastern Ukraine, which would be highly damaging. I don't see any overwhelming need to sign that agreement on Thursday of next week.
Thank you. Ambassador, I'm so glad you're still with us.
Okay, regarding the first question, I agree with the questioner and Neil that, in fact, promiscuous Western interventions has created an environment which makes it a little bit easier for the Russians to justify what they've done. Having said that, it's worth noting that each of the interventions in question were interventions against nasty and autocratic regimes, whereas the Russian intervention was precisely against democratic forces. Second question, regarding the Russian media. The problem is not just that it's a monopoly, the problem is that it's been directed by the top in a nasty direction. Neil's right that the information age, the internet, Twitter, and all that is a partial offset. But as we've seen, as attitudes have been mobilized in Russia, it's only a partial and unsatisfactory offset. But I don't think there's too much we can do about it. 3, on James Scher's question. While I agree with the panel, my other panelists, that the real disaster, or excuse me, an even greater disaster is the Red Army in Donetsk. Their position in Crimea is already a disaster. And I think for that reason, we have to send a message now. It would be very, very nice right now if both the United States and the EU were to financially sanction at least 1 or 2 prominent people in Moscow. That would put some teeth behind the threat of sanctioning a whole bunch if things get worse. And I think we need to have more in the way of deployments to the east in NATO, as again a demonstration that the Russian strategic position has not improved as a result of potentially seizing Crimea. We have to send some very clear markers now in order to make the second order consequences even more real for planners in the Kremlin.
Thank you. You seem to have the final say.
I'm very wary of applying moral relativism in these circumstances. You can draw lots of analogies, but they're all inexact. What we're actually looking here, if Russia annexes Crimea, that would be a unilateral and flagrant breach of international law for which there would be no acceptable justification. If one allows this to happen by force, then you are risking a repetition. There are so many international boundaries around the world which could be vulnerable to similar treatment. We could find ourselves in the deepest possible consequences, not just around the borders of the Russian Federation. Yes, this is one of the aftershocks of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes, Russia certainly had a case to argue over Crimea. There is an awful lot, as I said earlier, which could be negotiated over the status of Crimea, but it cannot be negotiated if Russia is unilaterally using force there. And our response to that has got to be very firm and very clear. We certainly should not step back from the position we've taken. So I think that's the message that has to be sent, that none of this says that all of our behavior over the last 20 or however many years you want to make it has been perfect, but let's not beat up on ourselves for something here that has been done in such a flagrant way. We must be very clear about it.
Excellent. Thank you for ending on that. Very, very strong, very firm, and no nonsense note, as always, Roderic. Ladies and gentlemen, we've packed, as always, in members' meetings, a tremendous amount in to 1 hour, thanks to great discipline and tremendous technology. I'm so surprised. Once upon a time, I tried to do a Skype link with Tiraspol, and Tiraspol managed to do it, and we failed. So we've come on a lot. I would say, just by way of self-publicity, that the Russia and Eurasia Programme is producing work on Ukraine on a daily basis. So I would invite you to check out the website, including some policy options, thus perhaps answering the question of tonight's meeting. Thank you very much indeed, especially to Ambassador for giving up your living room for us for the last hour, and also to Roderic, Lyne and Neil Buckley. Thank you.